I want to talk a few minutes this morning about sort of an overarching principle in the Buddha's teachings, and it is do no harm. And that's a broad blanket, but it's a central tenet of the path, and he talked about it often when he would give talks to his Sangha. But what does it mean exactly? The Buddha was once asked by a disciple, would it be true to say that part of our training is for the development of love and compassion? And the Buddha is said to have replied, no, it would not be true to say this. It would be true to say that the whole of our training is for the development of love and compassion. So one could argue that really all of this practice is founded on non-harming, and specifically the development of compassion and loving kindness. 2,600 years ago, the Buddha said, do as much good as possible, avoid harm, and purify your mind. So Buddhism, from its very beginnings, had a deep commitment to nonviolence and caring for others. And you really can't separate the practice and the teachings of the Buddha and nonviolence. They're so inextricably bound up. It's really a way of life. It's born of this fusion of spiritual insight and practical action. But that was 2,600 years ago. What does it mean in modern times? It's a very complicated expectation. Is it an absolute commandment? Is it, do we never ever? Or is it more a guiding intention and aspiration? And how does it apply to ourselves? What about do no harm to ourselves? Thinking about the ways in which we might harm our bodies by not taking good care of them. Is do no harm, does it not apply to ourselves, to our own physical well-being? Does it not apply to the harm we do ourselves emotionally by not practicing acceptance of all the parts of ourselves, even those we aren't particularly happy about the lack of self-compassion? I mean, that I think do no harm encompasses that practice and that perspective as well. But I think the best we can do and the best we can hope for without getting into too much rigidity is set an intention to do no harm with the knowledge that it is an impossible standard to achieve 100% of the time. For example, killing disease-carrying ticks or mosquitoes, you're harming them, but is it for a greater good to prevent disease? What about, killing animals for nutrition? Where do we draw the line? It's a moving target. It's not a rigid target. That's why it's not a commandment. It's an aspiration. It's intention. We try to be guided by do no harm. But it's a complicated world, and there's complicated challenges that do no harm greets us with. It's a very tough practice. I struggle with it, a lot. There's lots of potential for self-condemnation if we're not careful. If we do something harmful, how do we respond to ourselves? Because from this path, it's experiential. It's lived understanding of the nature of suffering. It's a lived understanding of the nature. It's not an intellectual exercise. We feel it in our bodies. We can feel that response. And it's a lived understanding of the practices which reduce or alleviate our suffering. And we do our best to cultivate insight, leading to behavior and actions that result in happiness and liberation for all as best we can. As best we can, okay. The Buddha was very clear and very direct in his teachings on the causes of suffering. We talk about that here all the time. The causes of unhappiness, the causes of violence. And those teachings can be tremendously beneficial to us individually and to the larger community and larger society, whatever our spiritual or political orientation. Okay, whatever one's, the Buddha devoted his life to the problems of the human mind and the reduction of suffering. He said, you've heard this quote before, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. And you'll remember the three root causes, the three overarching causes of suffering that he taught, and how he taught ways to counterbalance them. The three poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion. which as I've explored those, I think really encompass pretty much all the suffering in the world. I mean, I think you can lump all the suffering in the world under one of those three: greed, hatred, and delusion. And so we follow the path. We embrace the ethical teachings that he taught, which is foundational as well, until we internalize it. So that our choices, though never perfect, are made with care and personal responsibility. We do the best we can. The Buddha was asked by his disciple Ajita, and Ajita said, "What is it that smothers the world? What makes the world so hard to see? What would you say pollutes the world and threatens it the most?" And the Buddha answered, "It is ignorance which smothers, and it is carelessness and greed that makes the world invisible. The hunger of desire pollutes the world, and the great source of fear is the pain of suffering." You know, lots of folks in the West that aren't on this path think of those of us that follow this path, that all we do is focus on personal transformation and our own meditation practice, that we aren't engaged with the larger culture, that we don't care about the larger culture. And I would argue this is just simply not true. You know, particularly in Asia, if you look at Buddhism and the history of it, it's really been the glue that has held the fabric of those cultures together for thousands of years. You know, our path is really for the benefit of all beings, not just for personal growth and transformation. It's certainly for that, but that makes us better able to engage with the world and all the suffering in the world. You know, the response to the needs of others comes out of our practice, and it is the practice. You know, our world is one of many and interrelated crises. I don't have to tell you that. You hear about it every day. But but for us to cope with these challenges, as is true with all the world spiritual traditions, you know, we try to first work on ourselves and then bring that better self to engage with the world. You know, this distilled wisdom of centuries of human experience that is really common to most spiritual traditions. You know, Buddhism doesn't have a corner on that market. But again, as you've heard me say many times, the Buddha's teachings are as relevant today as they were maybe more relevant today than they were 2,600 years ago. You know, they are what the planet desperately needs now: wisdom, love, and compassion. In other words, non-harming. So let me stop there, and let's talk about non-harming and your thoughts about it.